your debate with Sam Harris, where he tried to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that human flourishing was how you explain moral values, where humans flourish.
Yes.
And I think, as you pointed out before, he confuses epistemology and ontology. Could you unpack that for us?
Yes. He identifies human flourishing, or really even more generally, the flourishing of sentient life, that is conscious life, which would include rats and pigs and horses and cows, as well as human beings. He identifies that with the good. The good is what promotes the flourishing of sentient life. And I challenge that assumption. I don't see any reason on atheism to think that the good is identical with the flourishing of sentient life, including human life. But then that's the ontological question. What is the good? What's the foundation in reality for moral values and duties? The epistemological question would be, how do we come to know the content of the good? And that's a very different question. One way to figure out, say, what you ought to do would be to ask, well, what would cause other people to flourish and to do well? And that might serve as a helpful guide epistemologically to the content of what is good. But that is not to answer the ontological question, what is the good, or what is the foundation of the good?
And he never answered that. Didn't you say in the debate something about if a sociopath decides to kill others, that he flourishes? What's to say that he's wrong about that on
yes, I thought this
Sam
was
Harris's own?
An absolutely fatal objection to Harris's case. He admits that there are possible worlds, say worlds populated by psychopaths, in which human flourishing is not identical with the good. The psychopaths flourish and experience life as wonderful and abundant, but they do so by inflicting pain and suffering on innocent people. And so he admits in such a world, the flourishing of people wouldn't be identical with the good. But if that's the case, then since identity is a necessary relationship, that means that the good is not identical with human flourishing, and that completely eviscerates his entire moral theory.
But why human flourishing anyway, Bill? Why on atheism do we have to...
Well, that's what I would like to know. I mean, why on naturalism would you think that the flourishing of these lately evolved, funny creatures on this speck of dust lost somewhere in the universe is the locus of moral worth? I just can't understand why anyone on atheism would think that. I would think that if atheism is true, then Richard Dawkins is right. We're just electrochemical machines for propagating DNA, and there isn't any reason to think that anybody or anything has a moral worth, much less moral obligations and prohibitions to fulfill.
It's important that our listeners understand the distinction that Dr. Craig is making here, because this, Bill, I see this all too often in the debates or just on the internet, that atheists are claiming that we say that atheists can't know morality or can't be moral. We are not saying they can't know morality or be moral. What we are saying is that they can't justify morality.
There you go. That's absolutely right. Of course they can know what is moral, and of course they can do the moral thing, because God does exist, and he's implanted the moral law on the hearts of all persons so that we know instinctually the difference between right and wrong. So of course the atheist can know what is right and what is wrong, and God holds him morally responsible for it. So the question isn't whether you need belief in God in order to know your moral duties. The question is, are there any moral duties if atheism is true?
Yeah, if there is no God, why not Hitler's view of things, or why not Mother Teresa's? There's really no way to adjudicate.
Who's wrong in a world without an absolute standard?
Maybe said by analogy, you can read a book without believing in authors, but you can't explain why there is a book unless there is an author. Likewise, you can read or know the moral law, but you can't explain why there is a moral law unless there's a moral law giver. And it would seem to me that the moral law giver, Bill, has to have the authority to create and impose such a law.
Yes, I think that's right, and very many atheists agree with you on that, Frank. I mean, people like Bertrand Russell, Nietzsche, Sartre, J.L. Mackie, many atheists would concur on this, that in the absence of God, that human morality is just evolved through socio-biological pressures and really doesn't have any sort of objective or binding validity to it.
Now, Bill, I also want to talk about an argument that you make that not many other apologists make, but you talk about the witness of the Holy Spirit. Can you unpack that for our audience?
Yes. Well, actually, this is one of the insights that I gained from Cornelius Van Til and his presuppositionalism. I'm not a presuppositionalist in apologetics, but I think the truth that Van Til saw was that the ultimate foundation for Christian belief is not argument and evidence, but it is the authority of God himself. God is the ultimate source of authority and knowledge of the truth, and I think through the internal witness of his Holy Spirit, he communicates to every person the great truths that one needs to know in order to find the knowledge of God and salvation. And it is through this inner witness of the Holy Spirit that any person, even a person who has no good arguments and evidence, can come to a confident knowledge of Christianity's truth.
Now, Bill, is that argument based upon general revelation, i.e. Romans 1 and 2, where Paul says everybody knows there's a God because of creator and conscience, or is it going beyond that to a salvific knowledge, in your view?
Well, I think it is going beyond that. I think the Holy Spirit certainly could work through general revelation in nature and conscience, but he also testifies to the great truths of the gospel when we hear them preached. When someone proclaims the gospel, the Holy Spirit convicts that person of sin and of the truth of what he's hearing and of his need for salvation, and will draw that person to a saving knowledge of himself.
I'm reading here in Reasonable Faith, page 67, and you're talking about a quote from Pascal. And you say this after you quote Pascal, and in which in the middle of the quote, Pascal says, "All I know is that I must soon die, but what I understand least of all is this very death which I cannot escape." And you go on to say this: Pascal can only regard such indifference as insane, people who are indifferent about God and Christianity. You say man's condition ought to impel him to seek to discover whether there is a God and a solution to his predicament. But people occupy their time and their thoughts with trivialities and distractions so as to avoid the despair, boredom, and anxiety that would inevitably result if those diversions were removed. Comment on that, Bill, because it seems to me that's where we are now in our culture, that people are apathetic and ignorant about what's going on. How can we wake them up?
Yeah, I think it was Neil Postman who wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And that does seem to me to characterize contemporary Western culture. We invent all these forms of entertainment and so forth to keep us from really thinking about the human predicament and our condition. And that is just mad. I can understand why someone would be atheistic or hostile to God, but I can't understand why someone would be apathetic about this question, because it changes everything, whether or not life has meaning, purpose, and value, or whether or not we're left with despair, death, and hopelessness.